Well, Poland's done it again. You'd think that after ousting the populist National Conservative government of the Law and Justice Party, the PIS, in 2023, voters would be able to take a breather for once. But no, less than 2 years later, they handed the presidential veto pen, which is incredibly powerful, by the way, as we're going to discuss, to Karol Nawrocki, a conservative historian and a PIS loyalist through and through. And if you're wondering why you should care, fair enough. In most of Central Europe, presidents are actually basically political wallpaper. They're harmless, decorative, and destined to peel off when the mood of the government changes, which it will inevitably. But the Polish president isn't just there to smile in photos and hand out medals. Unlike their colleagues from Slovakia, Hungary, or Czechia for that matter, Polish presidents are much more powerful. It's been designed this way. For one, they can introduce legislation of their own, which the other colleagues in the region cannot do. They even have a constitutional sledgehammer though, which is much more important, and that's the veto power over any law. And unless Parliament pulls off a 3/5 majority to override this veto, which hardly any government has been able to do, Tusk included, the law is simply dead on arrival. And that brings us to Karol Nawrocki, the fresh president. Most new presidents ease into the job, shake some hands, maybe Google where the office bathroom is, but Nawrocki, not so much. He walked in guns blazing and with his own paper shredder, and he's ready to bury Tusk's government's reform plans to the ground. I'm Jan, this is Prague Pulse, and today we're diving into how Karol Nawrocki's presidency could stall Tusk reforms, fire up the populist right, troll Brussels a bit, and maybe even give Viktor Orbán someone new to text after midnight. But before we begin, as always, thanks to everyone subscribing to the channel and supporting us either here or on herohero.co/pracpulse. And now, let's dive in. First, Nawrocki's powerful veto makes him not just a nuisance, but a full-blown roadblock to reform. Every big-ticket item that Tusk campaigned on back in 2023, judicial independence, media reform, abortion rights liberalized, closer EU ties, everything now hangs in the balance. The problem for Tusk is that even the current president, Andrzej Duda, is affiliated with the PIS. So that means that ever since 2023, Tusk hasn't been able to push anything meaningful through because Duda has also been doing his best to block him, and that is set to continue now with Nawrocki as well. Tusk will probably try to water his ambitious legislation down so that the chances are higher that he will reach a compromise with the president. But Nawrocki can block it no matter what, and in doing so, he doesn't even have to justify himself, much like Duda has done so far. And the result is probably going to be a government stuck in a vicious circle. See, if Tusk waters down his reforms, they lose impact, and he is seen as weak, which decreases his popularity. If he tries to push through something more ambitious, Nawrocki can veto it anytime. The PIS then blames the government for the lack of results, and Tusk is again seen as weak. No matter what, to the average voter, the result is the same. Tusk is seen as not delivering, which then makes it easier for the PIS to say, see, we told you so, they're useless, so next time maybe vote for us instead. And the strategy seems to be working. Support for Tusk's government is down to 32%, while 48% oppose it already. In terms of polling, so far at least, the PIS and the Civic Platform of Donald Tusk are polling neck and neck. So Tusk hypothetically still has a chance of winning next time round. But with Nawrocki actively helping to tilt the balance, which he most likely will be trying to, the PIS may not even have to campaign much in 2027. They just have to wait and point to the wreckage in a few years' time. What we can expect in the coming years is Nawrocki basically doing everything in his power to make governing as difficult as possible for Tusk. Given how respected presidents are in the heart of Europe in general, that includes Poland, of course, Nawrocki will definitely have a lot of options to undermine Tusk wherever he goes. And the long game is obvious. 2027 and the next parliamentary election. The PIS, of course, plans to paint Tusk as weak, ineffective, and out of touch with reality, which, remember, Nawrocki himself is going to be helping to ensure. with his veto and other more informal powers. Maybe the goal is to destroy Tusk's government even sooner than 2027, while the momentum is now still on the PIS side, as they probably think following Nawrocki's win. Some insiders are actually already whispering about the possibility of a snap election. After all, Tusk's government is composed of 4 big parties, which basically span the entire political spectrum. So it's basically a political miracle that those parties have been able to agree on a coalition in the first place. And that also means that it probably wouldn't take much, if someone really wanted to break up the government and force a snap election. A few defections, a few high-ranking ministers leave, and then the country is headed to the polls right away. Just recently, actually, media reported that Szymon Hołownia, speaker of the Sejm and member of Tusk's coalition, met actually with the PIS de facto leader Jarosław Kaczyński for a mysterious late-night meeting in Kaczyński's residence. Hołownia denies that he had any intentions of betraying the government, of course, but even if that in itself shows just how shaky and uncertain things are for Tusk and his government. And that's exactly the point. Nawrocki's influence actually goes well beyond simply vetoing legislation. It's also key in the areas of education, culture, and historical memory. And even if sometimes the president's impact is purely informal and not actually enshrined in the constitution, he, because of the influence he carries, he and the presidency, and also the party behind him, still have a lot of weight. And of course, the president's own ideological convictions then start to play a massive role here. Already when working as director of the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, the signs of Nawrocki's ideological leanings were quite visible. And that's probably also the reason why the PIS chose him as their candidate later on. Critics accuse Nawrocki of reshaping exhibitions in the museum to reflect a more nationalist tone. And this even resulted in some fellow historians later filing lawsuits against Nawrocki. They claimed that his work had a clear political motive and wasn't really academically objective, which, he should be probably aiming to be, given that he's an historian himself. It's simply clear that for Nawrocki, ideology is much more important than the facts. And the problem for Poland now is that as president, Nawrocki is in a position to use that ideology of his to shape how many different public institutions develop or don't, whether it's efforts to reform education, depoliticize state media, or promote broader historical narratives. Nawrocki could slow them down or block them entirely if they don't fit the worldview that he prefers. Don't get me wrong, sure, every president brings their own ideas to the job. That's normal, that's politics. The problem is that Nawrocki and Tusk aren't just different shades of gray. They're actually playing for completely opposite teams. And when the president and prime minister can't even agree on which way is forward, basically, the whole country then stalls. And that's the real issue. In foreign policy, Nawrocki's influence is probably more subtle, but still potentially explosive. On the face of it, he's pro-NATO, pro-defense, and anti-Kremlin. Sounds promising, right? Well, yeah, but dig a little deeper and you'll find landmines, as you would probably expect. Take Ukraine. Nawrocki considers Russia an enemy and supports military aid to Ukraine. Yes, and that's good. But he also ran a campaign full of anti-refugee rhetoric.
I speak the language of Polish men and women. I speak the language of Poles who have their own agenda of issues, both in the West and in the East.
He accused Ukrainian refugees of overloading public services, which is, the traditional excuse of people who claim to be on the side of Ukraine, but are in fact just spreading pro-Kremlin propaganda, and are therefore useful idiots, as we like to call them. The usual, we have our own issues, the Ukrainians are costing a lot of money, bullshit. Which is not only insensitive, but also, again, ignorant of the facts. The Ukrainian refugees are actually benefiting our economies massively, and we have data to prove it. And it gets worse. Nawrocki didn't just throw shade at Ukrainian refugees, he also hinted that Kiev's future cooperation with Warsaw might depend on agreeing to Nawrocki's version of history. When President Zelensky congratulated Nawrocki on his win, Nawrocki fired back with a reminder of the quote-unquote long overdue historical issues between their own countries. Translation: We might support you against Russia, yes, but only if you first apologize for something your grandparents did in Volhynia during World War II, where up to 100,000 Poles were killed, which is definitely terrible, but we'll probably agree that today's Ukraine is hardly responsible for it. And then there's the EU. Nawrocki loathes the so-called Brussels interference, whatever that is. He's already called the Green Deal eco-madness and rejected deeper EU integration. Expect confrontations over the rule of law mechanisms, climate targets, migration policies, and funding. And meanwhile, Nawrocki is also cozying up to Washington. Well, at least, of course, people around Trump. Nawrocki's campaign drew support from the MAGA movement, whose talking points Nawrocki has also mirrored. We had a tough rhetoric on anything you can think of, culture war politics, and a disdain for globalist elites. Unsurprisingly, Nawrocki then received a ringing endorsement from the Trump administration ahead of the second round of voting.
I just had the opportunity to meet with Karol, and listen, he needs to be the next president of Poland. Do you understand me?
I guess that meddling in European elections is again back in style over in the US. But to stay positive for once on Prague, if Nawrocki and Trump really do hit it off, which it now seems it might happen, who knows, it may just keep Trump engaged in Europe more. Maybe because he has a new MAGA friend over here right now, he may even forget that he wanted to leave the continent or limit the number of US troops in Europe. Maybe thanks to Nawrocki this will not happen. Nawrocki's win didn't just shift Poland, it sent shockwaves throughout Central Europe. People like Orban in Hungary, Le Pen in France, or Babiš in Czechia feel reassured now by the win. The message for them is clear. Populism isn't dead, it's just waiting for the right figure to bring it back from the ashes, if it ever was in ashes, which I'm not sure about, actually. So expect tighter alliances among conservative leaders. Hungary and Poland, once close under the PIS, could even rekindle their so-called illiberal axis. Slovakia's Fico, already turning his country into a full-blown authoritarian regime, will be happy about Nawrocki's win too. And across the EU, conservative parties will cite Nawrocki as proof that liberal centrist forces simply cannot last because they are incapable. And all of this makes Brussels really, really nervous. See, Poland isn't just any EU member state. It has one of the bloc's strongest militaries, as we've discussed on the channel before. Go and check that video out when you have time. It's been a key hub for supporting Ukraine, and it sits on NATO's eastern flank. So the hope was that with Tusk in charge, Poland would finally become a more stable, reliable security partner. But now there's a president in office who openly challenges basically half the EU's agenda, and nothing is certain with him at the helm. Sure, Poland's dislike for Russia, and that's a gross understatement, is likely to persist, even with Nawrocki. But at the very least, his election now has introduced a new unknown into the equation, which is the last thing that Europe needs right now when it needs to, be united and rearm in the face of the threats from the Kremlin. All of this is happening in a democracy which is still limping out of the PIS years. Tusk's coalition was meant to be Poland's big democratic comeback. There were promises of sweeping reforms and liberalization, but instead, with Nawrocki at the helm, no large reforms can be expected, and people will become more and more frustrated as a result. The problem is that if voters lose hope that change is possible, populists don't just win the next round of voting. They may get a chance to rewrite the rules so that no one else is able to play in the future. And remember that the PIS already started rewriting the rules last time around. We also had videos on that topic, so do watch them. There's simply no reason to think that they wouldn't try again if they win in 2027. And Nawrocki will do everything in his power to make sure that they do win. Regionally, a destabilized and polarized Poland weakens the EU's eastern flank. It also risks undermining support for Ukraine, emboldening authoritarian neighbors, and fracturing the unity that's essential to dealing with global crises from war to climate change. For Donald Tusk and the pro-European coalition, the clock is ticking. For the PIS, it's a second wind. And for the rest of us, it's a front row seat to one of Europe's most high-stakes political dramas of the time. So what do you think? Is Nawrocki the last gasp of a fading populist wave, or the beginning of a new chapter in Europe's illiberal turn? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for more and consider supporting me on herohero.co/practicals. This has been Jan. See you until next time.